Good afternoon. I'm Kenny Irby, senior faculty member here at the Poynter Institute, and we're here to talk about the photojournalism winners for the Pulitzer Prizes in the breaking news and the feature photography categories. Overall, I don't think there's any real surprise here. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch is no surprise for its 14 plus days of rioting and unrest in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death. In the city of Ferguson is no surprise. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch did just a phenomenal job of coverage of the broad range of the experiences that were happening publicly and in homes and in businesses in the lives of citizens in that Ferguson community. The feature category I think is a little bit of a twist, not a surprise, because it was probably the largest and most covered story of the year, the Ebola outbreak in Africa. And Daniel Berhuluk, actually independent photojournalist for the New York Times, won not in the spot news category, but in feature photography. And this was largely because the project was approached as a continuing saga and the coverage of the caregivers and medical workers, as well as those who were in the communities in Sierra Leone who were devastated by this disease, this virus. So we'll take a look at some of the photographs and talk about some of the unique aspects of composition and insight and access, which leads to great photojournalism. Okay, the New York Times series, which won the feature category this year, which, as I think it's worth noting, was a bit of a risk and a different movement on the New York Times editors' part to put this story in as a feature story, which is more classically defined as a found news situation or story project. And for Daniel, who is an independent contributor to the New York Times in photojournalism, clearly he had been following this story. He was a Pulitzer finalist in 2011, I think it was, for his Pakistan coverage. So he has been covering stories in Africa and in Asia for many years, being an Australian-born photojournalist. And this story covering the Ebola crisis in Liberia is so well documented, and it's largely because of the emotions and juxtapositions that were captured by the survivors, people who had to go on and struggle through life after losing their loved ones, and also dealing with the uncertainty of the infectious nature of the disease. And so in many of these cases, Daniel was documenting things that just happened in front of him, stories situations that included people in uncovered bodies in public places, and the protest and the anger that ensued as law enforcement and military workers tried to keep crowds back from quarantine areas and from medical relief centers. I mean, it's just an amazing documentation of the isolation, and quarantine was a big part of the story to try to curtail and maintain the disease. I think Daniel's photographs transport us to places where Americans and individuals around the world had never had no real inclination or understanding of how this distance and the severity of the situation manifests itself. The photographs of people trying to get information, the residents in the West Point area of Liberia is just a powerful example of the kind of protest that went on, where individuals were often juxtaposed or pit against huge crowds of folks who were trying to get information and get medical attention. And this photograph here is just poetically compelling in that area. For me, several of the photographs that showed medical staff working with individuals, particularly children, which is in always problematic and difficult and disturbing, were photographs that have kind of a haunting capacity and impact on me. When I look back and think about these pictures of how human lives, people were just being transported in the midst of brightly colored buildings, people in yellow space-looking quarantine suits. It's pretty powerful, and we don't see these kinds of things in America and other parts of the developed world. And so for Daniel, like all the other photographers, it's worth noting Michael Ducille, who lost his life covering this story from the Washington Post photographer, died in Liberia. And so I know that there were very few people who were able to get into this region to actually capture and be able to report the severity of this virus. And then in Daniel's body of work, he continues to move forward, not just covering the medical side of the story, but the human life, the struggle of being able to bury these people, to give some dignity and proper burials to individuals. This photograph from October 5th, is a haunting reminder of that part of the story. And again, children who were very often orphaned and left abandoned in this crisis, who were the most vulnerable. This photograph from December 6th really powerfully captures that isolation that children and others went through in the quarantining. And I think his coverage of the caregivers and health workers who had to continue to labor through in their moments of prayer, which in times like this was the only thing that they had. And then back to the body removals. This was every day there was a series of body removals, as most of the journalists who've been in that area, who I've had the privilege of interviewing, talked about dealing with death and maintaining some level of dignity, because these are important pictures for the world to see, so that people who could make a difference could do the things that they were able to do. And that's a powerful aspect of photography, to not only give voice to the voiceless, but hold the powerful accountable. And this body of work, I think, very powerfully does that. For me, image 13 in the series is probably one of the most haunting images, as these medical workers start to prepare themselves to go back in and assist victims, and this one woman just stands there screaming in front of the camera, not for the camera, but in the presence of the camera. It's just a very powerful image that reminds you of how helpless individuals were in the course of this 6-day period. And then the other thing is that Daniel had to find the access to be able to go into the homes in situations, as this photograph depicts, where the medical workers were going in as body collectors, as they're described, to go into homes and see these places where all the signs of life are still there, and this lifeless body is in the middle of the frame. These are the kinds of things that photographers have to witness, and had to dress appropriately to be able to go into these places. So it's not like you're just wandering in, you have to prepare yourself and protect yourself as well. The photograph of the workers entering the high-risk zone against the mirror is just an amazingly haunting photograph. The colors of the bright blues and the bright yellows juxtaposed against one another, with a bucket of water being carried as the medical worker in the foreground stands there being reflected in the mirror. It looks like a painting. So the aesthetic quality of these images are equally compelling to the authenticity of these moments. And then finally, in these last 3 frames, I think Daniel then moves to using framing devices. These are, again, highly sophisticated compositions that are more than just pointing a camera, but really thinking about the environment and using the environment as a part of the composition. Really thoughtfully done. And then frame 17 of the 5-year-old being carried to the ambulance. The urgency, I mean, I think there's a duality to the photograph, that the people all around are just kind of standing, but the medical worker is in such a rush to get this 5-year-old to the ambulance that it almost looks like he's just lugging a doll. And because you can't see a face of the medical worker, this every person, the kind of anonymity of the photograph adds to its urgency. And again, I think Daniel focused on the children, and the children who are, as this story continues to unfold, their uncertainty about their future is captured wonderfully and depicted in this photograph of these children just kind of gazing into a world that they're not sure what's to come next. And again, in the overalls that show the areas where the bodies of people have died in the funeral, the cemetery fields, it's just a really powerful image that shows an overall closing of this condition that continues to go forward for so many individuals who still have to try to find their loved ones as bodies were being buried without notification. So again, it's just a wonderful body of work in a tragic situation at the highest level of professionalism.